I'm Eric Paler. I'm a poor stand-in for the director of the Five College Digital Humanities, Mercer Parham, who's not here tonight. I'm one of the steering committee members and in the Department of Classics at UMass doing digital humanities and Roman archaeology. So it's my lovely duty to come and introduce the speaker tonight, Professor Ben Chang, who, as I will dive into my prepared remarks here, is an associate professor in the Department of Arts and is the director of the Game Simulation Arts and Sciences program at Rensselaer Polytechnic University. I'm going to set this down and awkwardly speak into it.
Like, hold that for you.
Oh my gosh, now we've really gotten here. So, all right, so thank you. As an electronic artist and scholar, his work explores the intersections of virtual environments and experimental gaming with contemporary media art. In addition to writing and teaching about this intersection, Professor Chang has coded programs, created installations, and built hardware to support his projects. And these projects have been exhibited around the world in Miami, Vancouver, Chicago, Athens, Sao Paulo, and more proximally down the road in Boston. His projects attempt to bring out the chaotic human qualities of technological systems. And Professor Chang defines his interest in this chaos and humanity of tech in, quote, what you could call an evocative and poetic experiences within technological systems, creating that powerful experience that you can get from great music, theater, books, and paintings through immersive and interactive simulations as well. But as he says, he's also interested in the experiences of being human, the human qualities that are still there within technological systems. Now, this is the point where I, in these introductions, digress a little bit and talk about something a little bit more reflective and interesting, I hope, to you as much to me. Because I'm an archaeologist, I'm interested in how the past was shaped, kind of moment by moment, in daily life of ancient people in the material world. How people make tools, technologies to shape their world, and how the form of that world eventually comes to shape them. For people in the past, as today, there was a frustration about the opacity of our present moment and its inability to recognize the broader trends that are surrounding us. On the other hand, of course, there is the essential elasticity of the present that produces those trends. This, in my humble estimation, is the space and the tension into which Professor Chang's work most importantly expands. At the intersection of technological function, cultural impact, and artistic detour, projects like synthecology, and I just want to note here for a second that the project came out in 2005, I think, and Prince's musicology came out in 2004. Was that just a coincidence? Or?
It's purely a coincidence.
All right. So that's really a connection I've made and no one else. Other projects, In-Security Camera, and especially the Sounder and Relay, and the extension, which is an extension of the Dots and Dashes project, explore how the conscious and unconscious agency of daily technologies and their users drives and often redirects larger structural realities of the longue durée that come to surround us all. Today we'll hear his talk entitled Time Becomes a Loop, Projects in the Real and the Virtual, 2005 to 2015. Please help me welcome Professor Ben Chang.
All right, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here, to be back here. I've called my talk Time Becomes a Loop for a couple of reasons. One of them is thinking about the work I've been doing in virtual reality and other kinds of immersive and interactive systems as this kind of looping refrain. We're in this moment where immersive tech has suddenly become popular again. Virtual reality has suddenly become popular again. We all thought it had died and disappeared forever a while ago. And so there's an interesting kind of repetition and reemergence and almost like reenactment of a lot of the themes and the ideas, the concerns and the debates that have accompanied immersive technologies and ideas in many other periods of time before. For me as well, this is also kind of a loop because I'm an Amherst alum. I think like the last big memory I have of being here was playing a show with my goth band on the landing over there up into the library. So this is like an interesting kind of flashback, looping experience, overlay of the past and presence for me in a couple of different ways here tonight. So I wanted to begin with this slide sort of to illustrate the overall theme here. So yeah, so as we've heard, virtual reality is becoming really popular now. This picture on the right is somebody wearing the Samsung Gear VR, which is one of the new VR headsets. And then it was also really popular in the 1990s. That's somebody wearing a head-mount display in the 90s. And then it was also really popular in the 19th century. So this is someone using a stereoscope. I guess this would have been about 150 years ago. Erki Hutamo, media archaeologist, describes this as topos, the idea of these recurrent themes and fixations that will reemerge in different periods in history in different ways, immersion being one of them. He also talks about memes and lolcats as a continually reemerging mediotopos. And so I think this is a thing that's very important to keep in mind, that this is a set of ideas and technologies and fascinations that have suddenly kind of emerged almost seemingly from nowhere in the last couple of years, very rapidly, and to think of that as just one more reemergence of many of those ideas going back a very, very long time. With this, I think it's important to talk about the apparatus, what the machine is, what the technology is, the specificities of it, because it's always different, and it's not neutral, it's not transparent, and it influences everything about what you make as an artist, for example. So I want to begin with just a little bit of background on some tech. This isn't really a technical talk. I could talk about the hardware and like the code for hours, but that would be a different presentation. We'll save that for another time. So a lot of the pieces that I do use a system called the Cave, which is a virtual reality device. It's a room with projection on the walls and often on the floor and sometimes on the ceiling, as much of it as you can get all around you. It's done in 3D so that you have this illusion of space out beyond the walls and the illusion of objects coming into the room. It uses motion tracking so that as you walk around inside it, the view that's projected onto the walls changes along with the motion of your viewpoint, which is a massive change in the way that we use perspective representation. Right? So typically in painting and in photography and in cinema, we have an arbitrary, artificial perspective point into the world. So this is an experience where that changes and is your actual point of view within this space. So this is just one or two images of what these systems look like. This is the one that we've built down at RPI. I'm also very interested in how to build these things cheaply. So they're often like $500,000 to make one of them. So I've been very engaged in trying to find ways to cut that down by factors of 10 to make them a little bit more approachable, something that could be used by more people and outside of such specialized environments. One of the things that it does is it uses these little little silver marker dots on your hat to tell where your head is, and you wear these 3D glasses, so it's kind of like going to a 3D movie to get this illusion of depth. And then you hold this little controller in your hand that's kind of like a pointer, a wand, and it can track where your hand is as well. So you have almost like a one-to-one mapping of a 3D input device of your own arm into the space, as opposed to using like a mouse, keyboard, game controller, that kind of thing. All right, so that's just some technical background, and I'll stop there unless anyone has questions about it at the end. The first project that I want to talk about is a project that deals with the virtual and the real, and this notion of the virtual in the real, right? So these are things that we often think of as completely separate. There's the real world, and then there's the virtual world that lives in our computers, in our digital systems. But there are also, I think, what you could call virtual things that exist in the real world, such as IKEA furniture, which is a kind of a simulacrum of real furniture. And so I'm fascinated by IKEA. I have a lot of it. It's sort of been my primary interior decorating strategy. One of the things that's also interesting about it is it has all these different families that are simulacra of different styles of furniture, right? And you can almost think of them as different species, different genuses of furniture within the IKEA family. So I made this piece that I call Better Living Through Modularity, which is, I guess the best way to describe it is it's an IKEA furniture mutator. If you were to think about all these different species of IKEA, what would happen if you started to crossbreed them and then evolve new kinds of IKEA from that? So I built this VR environment for the cave. It's a simulation of this really, really large loft. It's like gorgeous and empty, and you get this swirling mass of little IKEA pieces at the beginning, and you pick out small bits of it, and then you plant them into the floor, and then they grow, like a desk or a bed or a table or bookshelf or something like that. And then if you put two of them near each other, they'll kind of like reshake and then grow a new one, and will interchange pieces. So it's in terms of the actual program, it's very simple. It's just kind of swapping parts out. So something that would be a drawer in one thing gets swapped out for like the tabletop of a desk in another thing. Here's another little video that show you just a little bit of that as a screen capture. And I was thinking about IKEA also as this modular decorating strategies. The idea is you get to design your own space from all these pieces that all kind of fit nicely together. And what if we take that down to a much more granular level, where every bolt and board and bit of like kind of compressed treated fiberboard is is one of the modular elements. There's also my way of creating a space where I could actually decorate with all the IKEA stuff that I want. Because the thing is, if you go to an IKEA showroom, they have these, even though they say that's good for small spaces, the showrooms are enormous and cavernous. And I was living in these tiny apartments in Chicago where you'd buy these things and then get them home. There's really absolutely no room for it in there. So this is, in a way, maybe my fantasy home to put all this IKEA stuff into. So some of the projects that I've done are these kinds of experimental artworks, and some of them are a little bit more practical, or maybe attempts at making something a little bit more practical. So this next project is called The Lost Manuscript. It's an educational virtual reality / alternate reality game to teach people Chinese. So this was a very, very large project. It was led by my colleague Lee Sheldon, who's a game designer, and a number of our other colleagues at RPI, and a pretty large group of students on multiple teams over multiple years. And the overall goal was to build an experience that you could put into a college-level Mandarin class that would use multiplayer gaming and also immersion together to help drive engagement and involvement and motivation, and just see how that would change the educational learning, the learning experience for students. So there's basically two halves. One of them is what Lee called the multiplayer classroom. That's this idea of taking a class and turning it into a multiplayer, almost like role-playing game, which you could do with technology or completely without technology. And then the second half of it was the idea of immersion. So if you think about language as always being situated in places and situations, would this help the acquisition and the use and facility of language if students were always using it within that place instead of just in the abstract? So we created a game. It's an episodic, story-based game that takes place over the course of a whole semester. This is a section of the script. This is from episode 4, when the students, quote, travel to China. In this episode, they've arrived at the airport in Beijing, done Dr. Chen, who's their guide, is supposed to meet them there, but he's mysteriously disappeared. They can't find him. Instead, you just find this crumpled sign on the floor that says Rensselaer Travel Group. And that's it. So you've got to figure out how to get out of the airport. You have to get through customs, get your bags, figure out where your hotel is, how to use the phone, how to get a van to get you out of it, and then use all of the language skills that you've been learning in parallel in the class. We ran this first in what we call the dress rehearsal as essentially a live action role-playing game. If anyone's familiar with those. We hired actors to play the parts of Dr. Chen and Mrs. Ling and Inspector Pei and all these other characters in this game. And then each week, students would go through one of these episodes. So this is the arriving at the airport episode, where they walk into the classroom and there's a customs inspector that will talk to them, and then they have to make it past him, speaking only in Chinese, to get into the room, after which he leaves, we lock the doors, and they have to figure out how to get out. Later on, I think this is around episode 8, they get busted for breaking into the Forbidden City. There's a library where there's a mystery that emerges here, where there's a very rare lost book. That's the title of the game, the lost manuscript, that they have to find. And there are all these characters in the game who try to win the allegiance of the students to help them find the book. And they split the class off into groups, each one of them working with one of these virtual characters that also will communicate with them and send them text messages and emails and stuff throughout the week, and tell them not to trust the other students and stuff like that. So there's this kind of both cooperation and competition element that gets built into it. Anyway, so by about episode 8, they've gotten clues that they think it's in this library deep within the Forbidden City, so they sneak in there, and then Inspector Pei comes up and busts. So for this one, we dressed him up and made this fake police badge and everything, which leads into the final exam for the course, which is an interrogation at the police station. They have to then explain everything that they've been doing within the context of the game, why they're there, everything else that has happened, and then they have to be able to explain this under pressure in Chinese. So they did really well at this also. The neat thing with this, we took about one semester's content of Mandarin 1 and then crammed it into about an 8-week half course, and they all passed with flying colors. So that was some promising initial results. We did a version of this as a very simple 2D, two-dimensional computer game. This is this character named Danielle, who comes along with you as she's one of the students. Spoiler alert, she's actually a plant. So we take a student in the class, and they're actually working along with the puppet masters, the game masters behind the scenes. And her job is to sort of move the narrative along and either help out or hinder students at different points throughout the semester. It turns out she's actually secretly working for the mysterious Mr. X, who's the villain of the piece. This is a part where they're at the Summer Palace, and there's this famous stone boat, and then this famous Chinese opera building, and then they find a secret elevator that goes underneath that, and then there's a cavern and a lake beneath there, and it kind of turns into this Phantom of the Opera thing for a little bit, but anyway, so that's the overall story, and then we started building this in 3D. So this is the 3D model version of Inspector Pei and the airport. And so I should mention that this is not done by any stretch of the imagination. It turns out that this is an enormous amount of work. So we got the thing designed, and we built what we call a vertical slice, one section, one episode out of it as a kind of proof of concept. The one we did was something called the Kung Fu tea ceremony, which is a traditional-ish. I'm going to put the traditional in quotes because it's actually kind of complicated. But it's a traditional method of making tea in China with very specific ritual meanings and motions and ways of doing it. And then we built a tea house. I don't know if you can see this slide too well. It's a little, maybe a little bright in here for it, but we took this room, the cave with the projection screens, and then put tables and chairs and tablecloths and cups and dishes and everything to construct a tea house in the middle of it. And then students would sit at the tables in front of the screens, and then this is Mrs. Ling, who's this kindly character who's befriended the students earlier on in the semester and has invited them out to this tea house to learn about the tea ceremony. And what she does is she demonstrates all the steps for this, and then you have to reproduce them using this VR controller and a virtual tea set. And then at the same time, she'll ask you questions, or you can ask her questions, using this kind of aim, point and click menu up here. So these are different dialogue options that you have that you can talk with her about. So I'll play you just a little bit of video of what this is.
当然不会，功夫可以用在任何需要努力和技巧的情况下。
So you can see that we also put in some fallback options for translation between like full characters, pinyin, and then English translation, depending on the level of the students, and then also this option to put a subtitle up at the top of the screen for demonstration purposes when we're not using it in a class.
现在倒空茶壶，重新加满水，盖上盖儿。我们趁等着时间，用茶夹把茶杯里的水倒掉。低处倒茶可以防止茶水四溅，而且有助于保留茶的香气。茶壶里的茶泡的时间越长，味道越浓。如果不把茶水均匀分到各杯，最后一杯茶就会比第一杯浓很多。
And so you have to go through the steps of the tea ceremony, and then there's actually another neat thing that happens at the end. So this character is modeled after Professor Helen Zhou, who's one of our Chinese faculty. And so at the end of this scene, Mrs. Ling here walks off stage, and then Helen comes out from behind the screen dressed in the same outfit with actual tea. So it's kind of like that. In my mind, I think of it like the bit at Universal Studios. If you've ever been to like the Terminator show there's this part where this actor dressed as Arnold Schwarzenegger rides out of the screen on a motorcycle after watching this like 3D Terminator thing going on. So it's like this, collision of the virtual and the real. So sort of like that, but instead of Arnold Schwarzenegger and the Terminator, it's a tea. Having tea and cookies, but anyhow, so that was that project. It's not done at all, and part of the challenge is, of course, that we took on quite a lot with this mixed into it. One of the parts that we never haven't yet gotten to work is the voice input part. So the input method of pointing and clicking on dialogue options is kind of like a temporary solution until we get that part technically figured out. But anyway, so that's that project. So the next one is a project almost in two pieces, 2 or 3 pieces actually, over several different points in time. So this is a thing that deserves a little bit of background explanation. This is a project that begins with a lab called Art to the End Labs in Chicago, run by a woman named Ellen Sandor. And what she makes are these 3D reconstruction digital print photographs, some of them using a process called scholograms, which creates a kind of a stereoscopic inkjet print with it's like a lenticular lens grating across the top of it. So you can do these very high quality digital prints with a stereoscopic 3D effect to them without wearing glasses or anything like that. So a piece that she had done with the Showa Visual History Foundation was taking a photograph from the interior of the barracks at Auschwitz-Birkenau and then reconstructing this as a 3D model and then doing one of these scologram 3D prints so that you could essentially get this reconstructed view into what the interior would have been like inside that space. And then the next stage that led to was the creation of a whole VR environment. So this was initially made around 2004 by a group called Applied Interactives, led by Jeff Baum, Tard Margolis, and Keith Miller, and Ellen Sandor. And it was creation of a cave environment using fragments of architecture and fragments of the spaces from the camps. Not what you would call an exact replica or attempt to completely recreate that space, but more of an artistic meditation, perhaps, on it. And the experience that you have, you go into this empty landscape, and as you walk through it, the buildings and the figures and objects start to slowly reemerge and fade back into existence. Part of this has to do with the act of remembrance, the idea that there's nothing there until you revisit, until you remember. And the more the audience goes through it, the more permanent they become. So when you first walk through it, it will kind of slowly fade in, and then when you leave, it goes away again, or just leaves like a little bit of a trace. And then over time in an exhibition, the more audience members who go through it, the stronger that trace becomes, and like the more presence it has. So this has existed in basically 3 forms. It's also just internally a kind of like a media art history archaeological project. So this was made in about 2004 or 2005 for the cave. And then after a certain point, not really shown anymore because it's very hard to show cave virtual reality artworks anywhere. And then I got involved with it in 2010 and curated it into some shows of VR artwork. Which then led to trying to rebuild the entire thing because all the software and hardware had become completely obsolete. So it was almost impossible to actually exhibit and maintain and keep doing it anymore. So there's now like a 3rd iteration of it that's being rebuilt for the Oculus Rift, which is also a completely different experience than the original. But let me show you a little bit of video so you can get a sense of what this is about.
Sometimes in this wretched place, to get what you need, you have to trade things. I would never have thought that I could give up my most valued possessions for simple things. Bread, shoes, clothes, hats.
Nobody is better at hiding things. Nobody.
He keeps the capos guessing.
Quickly, quickly! The capo is coming.
Where did you get that?
So let's say one thing that I've found to be the most, I think the most successful with that piece is the experience of space. So something like the space within the barracks is an incredibly cramped, compressed, claustrophobic kind of a space. And this is something that's hard to get across just looking at pictures or at drawings or blueprints or film or anything. And one of the things that VR can do is give you this experience of the relation of your body to space and bodily scale and architectural scale. And this has a kind of a visceral impact to it that is, I think, different from what you can get from other kinds of media. So what we've done with this is use the actual original blueprints of the buildings to reconstruct it. And what VR gives you is a one-to-one scale. It gives you the ability to have an image that you are in front of, encountering inside, that is at a one-to-one real scale in relation to your own body. And so I think there's something particularly powerful about that element in particular with that work. So one of the things that I've been talking about is this refrain, this continual repeat of immersion and ideas of virtuality in cyberspace, right? And this next piece kind of deals with this really explicitly, thinking about the telegraph as the first cyberspace. And in a way, if you want to have a more speculative approach, if you combine the telegraph and the stereoscope, then you would, in a way, have like all of the elements for the Matrix in the 19th century already. The telegraph it's a really fascinating technology. It's easy to look at it as something that is just completely overtaken, made obsolete, subsumed later on by the telephone and by radio and television and the internet. You can say, oh, the telegraph is the Victorian internet in a kind of a quaint way, because it's sort of like this cute mini internet, like the old-fashioned mini internet, which is true. But it's also fascinating because of all the ways that it both prefigured the modern internet and is also different. So it also suggests other ways that we can imagine a cyberspace that are not within our current conception of it. Just two things right here that are kind of fascinating. The way that the telegraph was described and thought of, the way that it existed in the popular imagination at the time. So this is a quote from Harper's in 1873, where you see these terms like the web suddenly coming up. And also these words like here, the system quivering from end to end with signals of human intelligence. So this idea of the telegraph as almost like this living electrified thing is kind of fascinating. And that's something I think that's a little bit different. We don't really think about the internet quivering that much. It's just kind of like there on top of us, all around us all the time. You know, it doesn't have that kind of quality to it. This painting on the right by John Gast called American Progress, it's this kind of like allegorical painting representing the progress of America's march across the western half of the continent, its manifest destiny, and all of the components in here. Oops, it went away. So you have the wagon trains, and you have the railroad in the background, and you have all of these noble settlers and pioneers, and looking over all of them is this spirit of enlightenment and liberty, and what she has in her hand is a telegraph wire that she's stringing down on poles as we go. And you can also see the light in this painting off to the right in the east. There's this light that's like slowly sweeping away the darkness that exists in the west. And it's the telegraph wire on this thin strand that makes all of this possible in this retelling. So it's fast and really problematic image in lots of different ways, but it gives you like a thought in the kind of importance and role that the telegraph had at that time. One of the things that the telegraph also created was romance novels. So this is a project called, or this is a book, sorry, called Wired Love, a romance in dots and dashes. It's written by a woman who's a former telegraph operator, and then she then took to writing and wrote a romance novel about telegraph operators and online dating over the telegraph. So her protagonist, Natty, she's single. She lives in this boarding house. She works in this little tiny cramped telegraph office. This first page right here sets out this really interesting description of the two worlds that she lives in. The world, like her drab, dreary, mundane, everyday world, and also this magical world out over the telegraph, that she can kind of escape from the confines of her everyday life. So this is fascinating. This is the idea that it's a space that gets created. If you think about the telegraph in terms of bandwidth, right? It's almost like the minimum amount of bandwidth. It's a single bit communication system, but yet it creates this illusion, this imaginary experience of spatiality that you would not, at least I wouldn't have actually expected. In the book, all this fascinating stuff happens. So she meets this guy who's also a telegraph operator, and they start chatting online. And at first, she's not sure if he's a man or a woman, and like there's this like fun little gender confusion thing that goes on for a little bit at the start. And the other interesting thing about it is that it's all public because the telegraph operator circuit just has everybody on that line together. It's not just only point to point; it's more like a ring network. So they're starting this flirtation with this whole crowd of people listening to them and interfering and kind of like sticking in their own 2 cents here and there. So it's kind of like, it's like Twitter, I guess, is probably the best analog that I've been able to come up with for what this is. And then at one point they're going to meet, and this other guy, like he shows up at her house, and he's horrible, and he smells bad, and is like really rude and uncouth, and like totally unlike this awesome guy that she's been talking to online. And of course, it's not really him; it's this other guy trolling them. Because he's been listening in and has decided he's going to play this prank and show up at her house and pretend to be this other guy, which then breaks them up, of course, because like now she won't talk to him online anymore because she thinks that he's this jerk. But then like love prevails, and they end up through this sort of Deus Ex Machina operation of romance novels, coincidentally living in the same boarding house, and then like finally like they don't know who each other are for a really long period, and then they finally figure it out, and then they can't get together because strict Victorian morals prevent them from being in the same room alone without a chaperone, and so they end up building a secret telegraph network between their apartments by stealing equipment from their offices, and then like having these like late night telegraph chats. Anyway, so this is a sort of a research area that I've been involved with for a while with Sylvia Rosenko, who's my frequent collaborator and wife, and like collaborator in a lot of different projects. We have a couple of bioart projects that we've made over the last 5 years, but that's another talk. So this is one of the projects we did about this about the telegraph called Sounder and Relay, and it's a video installation where we have 2 projections of Natty and Clem, the 2 main characters, in their separate apartments, talking late at night over their clandestine pirate hacker telegraph system, and then we got actual telegraph equipment and mounted that to the wall so that you could hear what they were saying. Because a telegraph is a tactile and auditory communication system in a way that's also, I think, quite different from any other cyberspace system, communication system that's come after that. So here's this little video so you can see and hear what that sounds like. we've created these 3D animated characters of the two of them, and then put them into a game engine, and then attach that to an Arduino, and then attach the Arduino onto an antique pair of sounders. So then we have all of this text of their conversation that then drives the animation, and then also gets translated into Morse code and fed out into the telegraphs. One of the kind of like fanciful ways that we thought about this is that it's this inversion of the real and virtual. So what normally happens in the telegraph or in like pretty much any kind of electronic communication is that you have something that's happening in the real world, you translate it into an electronic form, and then it comes back out into the real world again on the other side. And here we've, in a way, inverted that so that they live in the virtual world, and that the communication between them comes out in audio form out into the physical room that we're in, and then gets transmitted back to the other side again. So, as part of this, these investigations into virtual and the physical, this has led into thinking about virtual and then also real bodies and kind of like amalgamations of them. So I'm going to show two projects that are exploring some of these ideas. The first one is a project that Sylvia and I did with Catherine Behar, who's at Baruch College. Called Apparatus, or there's an app for that shirt. It's an app for shirts. So it's an augmented reality. It's an augmented reality fashion show / performance is basically what it is. We designed these custom textile patterns and garments with these paisley things all over them, and then created an AR app for the iPhone that would then be able to track those patterns on the shirt, and then apply other kinds of objects or animations or deformations onto the garment. So if you think about what garments are, is like at a basic level, they're protective, but they're also bodily extensions. It's like a way of extending your physical self and transforming, changing it in some way. So I thought, well, what if you could then also make extra things start to come out from that? There's one of the things that it does is it creates these weird bulgy amorphous lumps that transform your body or create holes. Like what if you could carve a hole through the middle of someone's torso by looking through this thing? So this is what it looks like. We initially conceived of it as a sort of catwalk fashion show kind of scenario, and it changed a little bit into a more of a dance performance in the round sort of situation for reasons which I'll get into in a minute. But what you can see are these performers wearing these garments, and then through the iPad or the iPhone, these small 3D models and paisleys and sparks and things that start to erupt out of them or grow on them. So there's this series of this kind of like growth of little gray cubes and octagons that have started to emerge on her side right here. Now, one of the things that we discovered when we did this is that computer vision is really hard, and the cameras on your phones aren't actually good enough to do the kind of stuff that we wanted to do, because what happens is there's a limit of distance that you can have. Once you get too far away from the image that you're using as a marker, the software can't pick it up anymore. It doesn't interpret it. So what happens is for it to work, you have to actually be really close to the thing you're looking at. So you've seen this with other augmented reality games and apps. You have like a little book that you look at through your phone, and then stuff emerges on it. Or like the Nintendo DS has this with little cards that you can play games with. And it's all predicated on having like about 1 or 2 feet worth of distance between your device and the image. That's the sort of the fiducial tracking marker. And in a fashion show, you're usually a little bit farther away from the models for the, and so it didn't work at all. So we had to change it into this thing where the audience was really, really close to the performers, because otherwise it just doesn't function. So we have this group of performers moving and performing this series of different dances and movements in this sort of circular space with the audience kind of closed in really close around them. And so the way you have to experience this by holding your phone and like getting really close to somebody and looking at it, and then these happen, it's uncomfortable in a way. We had tried to make this thing work within the framework of like fashion show, where like basically everyone's just like looking at their phones anyhow because you're just like recording it. So it seemed like this sort of natural extension of the way the situation normally works. And instead we had to create something very, very different. And this is, I don't know if you can see it in the image too well, but it's a kind of a paisley thing that's disconnecting off of the body. So you get this cloud of paisleys that start to create a shell around you in one of the scenes right here. Plus, I think that the garments are just really stylish. It's a terrific line. We've got a ready-to-wear line coming out later. Anyway, so then the second project, also dealing with virtual bodies, if you will, is a project that Sylvia and I did called Becoming. And in this project, we were thinking about the way that people change each other. If you're in a very close relationship, you start to pick up your partner's nervous tics or like their laugh or it's like little characteristics. You kind of like infect each other a little bit with aspects of your own personality. Sometimes people who have been together for a really long time, they start to kind of look like each other, And so we thought, well, what if you made something where that was really, really visibly represented? So we made avatars of ourselves, and then we have them living on these two different screens. And there's this program that runs constantly that exchanges pieces of the 3D models. So it'll look for polygons that are on like my elbow and then like the matching polygon on her elbow, and it'll just swap them. So it's actually basically the same code that runs the IKEA furniture mutator. You can see there's like sort of a repeating theme here in some of this work. But then it runs for like months at a time, and then after quite a while, we end up with these like very, very strange, strangely transformed versions of ourselves. So that's her. Here's me, getting mutated a little bit, and the two avatars, they just kind of hang out. They just like loaf around on the couch and stand around and don't really really do a whole lot. They just run these idle animations, and then that long streak right there, that's the polygon shooting from one across to the other. And then this is what this looks like with the two of them kind of sped up. So this is kind of like a time-lapse thing. You're seeing is probably about like 2 weeks worth of it running. And it never really resolves into one or the other. It's just like this kind of constantly transforming, changing, shifting, fragmented pair of selves. So the next couple of things I want to move to are some very recent work. So this is one of the most recent projects we've been doing on the theme of future cities and garbage islands. This is a project called Archipelago that we did with Young-Suk Lee, who's a media artist in Indiana. And it's part virtual and part physical. There's an interactive projection. There's this table with a kinetic sculpture on it and a bunch of sensors, and a kind of a tablecloth terrain made out of garbage, mostly plastic bag waste. And this is a piece that we did, it's actually still up right now, for a festival called the Hong Kong Shenzhen Biennial of Design and Architecture. It's a very long title, but it's an architecture biennial in Shenzhen in China, which is very, very close to Hong Kong. I'll just say a little bit about Shenzhen because it's a really fascinating place. It's an absolutely massive city that has grown up extremely rapidly in China. It began as an industrial production zone because of its proximity to Hong Kong, and is also sort of like the electronics, one of the electronics production centers of China. It's also now a design and artistic creation center. So it's been going through an enormous number of transformations. In urban studies, it's also well known as the home of what are called urban villages. So these are small villages where when the city was growing, instead of tearing down the village, they just grew the city around it. So there are complete original villages in what had previously been just open farmland, rice paddies, that have had a city sprout up around them, and the rest of the village remains almost intact, kind of hemmed in by this absolutely monolithic structure. So it's also one of the major places where all of our electronics come from. Foxconn is there. This is where iPhones are born. In Shenzhen, they have these absolutely mind-blowing electronics malls with like everything you could possibly imagine. And it's also home to some of China's best theme parks. This is Windows on the World, which is a theme park with tiny monuments and recreations of famous sites from around the globe. So this is like tiny little cities and little miniature scale models of the Eiffel Tower and that thing. Charles de Gaulle's yacht is also there for some reason. I'm not sure why, but anyway. So this was the place where they had this festival, and it's a place that's also very much permanently under construction. So this is a piece that has multiple elements in it. This is the central sculpture, this kind of kinetic 3D printed thing, and then this massive plastic bag waste all over the table with LEDs and sensors and motors activating different parts of it. We were thinking about two things with this project. One was a kind of an evolution of cities, and the other one was an evolution of waste. We were thinking about garbage islands, these massive accumulations of plastic waste in the middle of the oceans, and then like what happens to turtles when they eat them, and other organisms in sea life. And then what could maybe grow out of them? So these are these little motorized mushrooms that grow up out of the detritus and the plastic bags and the netting. And there's this little flow of projected light energy that goes around all over it. Right here. And there are little fragments of plastic bags that have been made into textiles with embroidered maps across them. And then above that we have these cities that begin as a small seed of a little cube and then slowly evolve and grow piece by piece into this kind of like three-dimensional swirling mass. There are sensors on them, so when you walk up close to it, it activates the little parts of it. So you have these little like mechanical mushrooms that pop up and start moving around. And then the central sculpture, which is it's kind of like the dying turtle slowly coming back to life. If you pet its tail, then it kind of opens up. It has this sharp, spiky shell with its heart on the inside of it. So the last pair of pieces that I'm going to show just very briefly have to do with more explicitly with sound in virtual spaces and the network, which is like another thread that's been going along through a lot of this work. Oh, but that's totally like not even the right title. But this is Synthecology, which was a multi-user immersive VR collaborative sound sculpting space. I'll show you just a little video and then explain what this is.
You catch it.
All right, I'll try.
Oh, well, right at the peak of your... Oh, yeah, well...
Too far. Too far.
It's actually very tricky, and it's not like real physics.
Hey, don't tickle me. Hey!
Okay, there's more puffballs if you want to play at them.
Can you... Oh, never mind.
The physics is a good...
So what we were doing in that piece, we created this, it's kind of like a little island beach environment, and then multiple people in different caves around the world would connect into it. So you'd be in there with like 3 or 4 other people at the same time. And these little puffballs come drifting in over the water, and you can grab them and then plant them in the ground, and they each will grow this weird little plant that has a sound in it. So they're all musical objects. And some of them are plants, and some of them are crystals, and some of them are caterpillars. It's like a whole range of different things. And you can pick them up and arrange them around the beach to create this sort of spatialized composition. And you can also play games with them. So you can like throw this like singing caterpillar back and forth across the sand with the other people. So let's go move on to the next one. So what we were interested in with this piece was kind of trying to create a collaborative, creative experience with sound and with space over the network, and then that in a way that's kind of led to one of the most recent things I've been working on, which is called New Atlantis, and this, like almost everything else in this presentation, is a large collaboration. This is with faculty and students at the École Nationale Supérieure de Création Industrielle in Paris, and the Locus Sonus sound art research group at the École des Beaux-Arts in Aix-en-Provence, and School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and at RPI. And essentially what we've been building is a multiplayer, sort of like Second Life type sandbox world devoted to sound experimentation. So the name New Atlantis comes from this passage about the sound houses of New Atlantis by Francis Bacon. So this is this famous utopian novel where he writes about all of the incredible things that they have in New Atlantis for manipulating and storing and working with sound. They have these houses that they use to store sound, and these devices that can transmit sound and manipulate sound, and these things that are like, I think, are basically like iPods that he's talking about in here, and ways of changing and chopping it up and things like that. So we've created this environment that where you can take your own sounds and your own objects and interactions, and then upload and program them into this space, and then really create these collaborative sonic environments. So I'm just going to show you a few very short clips from a performance that we did at a place called Le Cube in Paris in January. So this was between 4 different sites, between Paris, Aix, Chicago, and RPI, networked together with the main audience in Paris. And one of the one of the interests in this has to do with acoustics in space. So taking sound and then moving it into simulations of different acoustic properties in different kinds of spaces. So here we all move into this house, and there's a little control that you can use to drop small rocks. And then we begin dropping these rocks, and it builds up this kind of polyrhythm that has a certain acoustic effect within that space. And then as we move along to other spaces like tunnels and caves, and there's like a sports arena later on, and then like the acoustics change in each one of these, and then we construct different rhythmic compositions. And there's also like a piano dropping battle that happens a little bit later on in this part. And then this is another section where we're running over these little bumps in the ground, and each one of those is a musical note. You can see the avatars that we've created. We didn't want to use just like regular human avatars. So your avatar is a microphone mesh covering with two enormous ears on it, flying around. And then each one of these little scenarios are something made by students in the workshops that we've been doing with this in the different schools. So it's essentially this whole collection of very small little sound experiments. And so part of this is this idea that you could make a world where like almost everything is a musical object. You know, almost everything creates sound, which it does, of course. But some sounds are more useful than others in the real world. So being able to bend those rules a little bit makes something that can be a more immediately sonically rich experience out of things that otherwise would just not sound that great. This is this strange theater that you find in a tunnel up in the clouds, and there's no visible audience or performers. But if you walk through and knock over the chairs and the furniture and bump into things, then little pieces of this play start to occur. In this part, we've gone to Chicago, and then flying above Chicago is this solar system made out of the Ring Cycle by Wagner. So each one of the planets is one of the main, like the characters and themes, and so you can set them in motion, and then so like all of the ring of the Nibelung starts like swirling around you, and then the center of it is Siegfried, who's this kind of slouching teenager sitting on top of the of that planet, just texting and playing with his phone there. Let's see if we can crash into him. So that we knock him off of his perch and he starts floating off into space also. And then this is the last little bit is this a small forest spinning out into this sort of barren winter valley, and there are these birds who live there that each have different sounds attached to them, and then they'll flock and swarm and move around. And so if you lie kind of in the middle of it, then you get this cloud of sound that's constantly flying around between you, and with all those sound elements interacting with each other. So anyway, those it's kind of like an overview of projects that I think like do have this kind of like looping quality, honestly, to them of working with some of these concerns with virtuality and physicality and audio and different kinds of virtual and real spaces. So anyway, thank you much. And I'd be happy to take some questions if anyone has any. Yes.
If you have questions,
oh, actually, and we have a
you can speak
microphone
into here
right
so we get you on the recording.
I forgot her name, but the Michelle that was the plant in the one interactive game.
Oh, Danielle, yeah.
Danielle. Mm-hmm. How did you make sure that she wasn't found out, or were the students supposed to just know that she was a plant?
Oh, they're not supposed to know at all.
Okay.
I mean, yeah. So this is, admittedly, this would be a challenge if we did this every semester, because like people like it would be on Yik Yak and stuff. You know, like it'd be hard to keep it buried. And this is, I guess, one of the things that's like a challenge with working in between doing something that's like a live acted, interactive story format versus one that's completely digital, right? So if you do the whole thing live acted, you'd have the improvisational ability to rewrite the script and change things every time you ran that class. It's a lot of work to do that because you need a you need a playwright to work with like every class every semester, I guess, or you need people who are really good at improv, and you need like actors you have to hire actors for like every class too. So then the theory is that, well, we could do this digitally, which would save some of that. But then if you make a change like that, we say, okay, well, we're not going to have that character this time around. It'll be something else is the twist. That's a lot more work to do because all of the production work goes into it. So yeah, I don't know. That's a real interesting problem.
All of my unemployed actor friends would really like to see that integrated into
pedagogy. I know, right? There's a. I think it's got potential, frankly. Let's see. Was there another question back here?
So you mentioned this a bit with the Remembrance project and integrating things with the Oculus Rift and sort of the newer technologies, but what other ways are you looking to or have already sort of considered integrated the new paradigm of consumer products into your work?
Yeah. So that project with the Oculus is probably the one we've done the most with, and the reason for it is not really about wider dissemination exactly. So we don't have an immediate plan to like put this up on the Oculus store, but it was for the purely practical reason of museum exhibition. So we had a show at the Art Science Museum in Singapore, where it would be very difficult to get the equipment over for doing the large projection system, partly because it's a very architecturally strange building and everything is completely like round, so there's no easy way to set up projection screens in there. So we developed the Oculus version as a more lightweight way of traveling it over there. The next one that we're actually working on is a piece I didn't actually show tonight, but showed in the class at Hampshire yesterday. So with Sounder and Relay, there's another piece that came before that called Dots and Dashes, which is also a cave VR piece. And so that one, Sylvia and I are converting that over to the Oculus Rift for another thing that's going to be at Baruch College in April. It's a really interesting thing. I feel like there's a real difference between the different technologies. The experience of seeing something on the Oculus and then seeing something in the cave are like they have a lot in common because they're both immersive, but they also have a lot of differences both in the kind of immersion you have and then the kind of physical, like levels of physical discomfort and sacrifice that you as an audience member have to make and that kind of thing to add into it. But yeah, I'll tell you in terms of VR tech, the thing that I'm really enjoying the most right now is the HTC Vive. And the fun thing about that is it has sort of like larger, slightly, not exactly room size, but a larger tracking area. So you can stand up and you can walk around while you're wearing that thing as opposed to just being locked down into a chair. Like that one's actually really neat. Let's see. Yeah.
On the last piece that you showed, could you talk a little bit more how all the different sections were connected?
Mm-hmm.
Were different people working in the same space, or what was it?
Yeah. So the way that it works is there are a series of virtual spaces and a series of physical spaces as well. Okay. So the physical sites are Paris and Aix-en-Provence and Chicago and Troy, and then the way that the system works is that anyone can create a virtual space, and then you can put whatever you want into it. So you can create 3D models and sounds and images, and then you upload those into that space. It's kind of like an open sandbox, and then you can share all those objects with other people, and then multiple people can add things into one space together. In those scenes, the places where there are like a lot of small little vignettes, little small rooms or places, those are all put together into one very large place that's like a series of islands out in an ocean. And each one of those were made by one person. They just uploaded them and combined them into one virtual environment.
So is that like a Unity virtual environment?
Yeah. So the actual technical stuff with it, we used, the whole thing's done in Unity. We use Unity to run the server, and then everybody connecting into it is running a Unity app that's a client into that server. And then the way you make stuff is you actually have to use Unity to make your objects and sounds and scripts and interactions. And you export it out from Unity into what's called an asset bundle, which is just like a little wrapped up, like zipped up package of those things. You upload that into a server, and then when you run the new Atlantis player, then you can connect to the server. You get this list of objects that you have that are in the database, and then you can grab any of those and then insert them into the scene. And then that gets propagated out to everybody else connected to it. So it's a persistent virtual scene for everybody who's attached to it. So if you've used Second Life at all, that's probably like the closest thing as a model to the way that it works. So like we're trying to approximate that, I guess.
I saw a demo of it a year ago in Aix-en-Provence.
Really?
It looks completely different. So
Wow.
Sort of like, that's why I...
Yeah,
that's
okay.
So, I mean, I had some experience with it.
Yo, that's, man, small world. Yeah, so the one that you saw then might have been still the Panda version. We've been doing this also for about like 10 years. It's gone through like 3 different technology iterations.
No, I know
Yeah,
that. That's why
yeah.
I'm like, oh, is this the same thing as the scene?
Yeah, it's made an enormous amount of progress in the last year, I will say that. Anyway, yeah, we should talk more about that.
Kind of talking about going through different iterations of technology, you mentioned that a lot of these projects that are even from 10 years ago, the software and hardware are already completely obsolete. Is that something that you think about as you're creating new projects, how they're going to move forward, or is that something that happens after the fact?
Yeah, I try to think about it. And then at a certain point, I often have to compromise and give up and just do what's possible now. So in an ideal world, the strategy I would have would be to make everything using only open source software. Because that way, in the worst case scenario, 10, 15, 20 years down the line, at least someone has access to all the source code to be able to either port and rebuild that software for a newer computing system, say, or be able to dig in and see exactly how everything worked to then replicate it in something else. So this is the experience that we had with special treatment, because that was made in a system called Yggdrasil, which is a scripting language created at the Electronic Visualization Lab in Chicago by a guy named Dave Pape, who's one of the people who created the cave in the first place. And it's a very specific scripting language. It's very, very easy to use. I taught this at the Art Institute to art students for about like 8 years for people who had like never touched programming at all, and they would just like make these incredible cave environments with it really quickly because it has like a very nice, easy to learn syntax. It's a little bit like VRML, if anyone remembers that, right? Kind of a similar structure to that. That was built on top of something called OpenGL Performer, which is a C++ library created by SGI, remember them, as a kind of like VR simulation and visualization toolkit. That was originally designed to run on the IRIX operating system on SGI computers. So there's like this whole stack of stuff that just doesn't exist anymore. And at a certain point, it was ported to Linux, and so that was all made in like Red Hat 7.3 Linux. And then that was like the 2004-05 version. And then in 2010, when I started to try showing it, I would build new Linux systems, and none of it would work because all the audio drivers had changed since 5 years ago. But having all the source code for it meant I could do that. And so now making this in Unity, if something fundamentally changes 5, 10, 20 years down the line, it would be very hard to actually do that without emulation or complete reconstruction of the thing. Let's see. Yeah.
Can you speak more to your use of Unity on other projects and some of the other softwares you work with today?
Sure. Yeah. Let's see. I think which things did I just show? So the Lost Manuscript, that was all made in Unity, and the neat technical thing we did for that was we built cave support into Unity, which wasn't there before. Let's see. There's an app for that shirt. We did that one in Unity using the Vuforia plugin, which is what does the computer vision and AR tracking. That one was actually done using OpenGL Performer in this Yggdrasil language. So if we ever want to, if we want to show that one anymore, we have to build a new Linux system or like maybe port that over to Unity or something else. I don't know. Let's see. Sounder and Relay is made using Panda 3D, which is an open source 3D engine originally from Disney, weirdly enough, and the Entertainment Technology Center at Carnegie Mellon. So that one is using Panda, Python, and Arduino. Let's see. What else? Yeah, so it's a real mix. I try not to be a single engine, single platform kind of person, and part of that is because I've been burned really badly by this in the past. So there's a whole other body of work that I'm not showing here that came before this. That was all done in Macromedia Director, which was at the time was this amazing thing. Like that was one of the tools that enabled the CD-ROM, the multimedia revolution in the 90s, and it facilitated the creation of this whole field of interactive art, both on the screen and also in installation formats and performance formats. And then Adobe bought it and they killed it, and you can't do anything with it anymore. You can't open I can't open any of my files from this era because I need to find a pre-OS 10 Mac to be able to even open anything or put a disk into it. So I got really badly burned by that thing. So I've tried to kind of diversify my tools, I guess you could say, and not use only one thing for everything that I'm making, which is hard because I have to keep constantly relearning new programming languages. But then there's this kind of like defensive things. So like if Unity goes out of business, then at least I've got like some things I've been making using Unreal or using processing or whatever, that I can keep doing that, and I won't be completely completely dead in the water.
I hope I'm speaking for everyone here when I say that it's just been really amazing to hear you see and to say and to see all these things, and I've been kind of piqued and provoked in many ways, and I'm supposed I should only ask one question, but I want to say two things first. And one is that, I'm so intrigued by the amount of improvisation that your work creates, and the freedom that allows. But I'm also then, from the kind of perspective of more of an anthropologist, wondering to what degree you're actually documenting the way human improvisation works. And so that's just one thought. The other thought is that now I'm thinking about an archaeology game about digital sustainability, right? And you actually excavate through a hard drive and see only the parts that you can get as you look at the writing and overwriting, that layering and stratification comes through this, and you can think about that and layer that into the programming that you've just talked about and how that can come through. That's not my question.
Okay.
My question is that because I teach large lecture classes, your multiplayer classroom was amazing, and I wonder if you have any thoughts about the idea of turning what is often a problem, which is the inability to interact with people at small scales because of the scale of the classroom. Is there a way to turn the corpus, the kind of the mass of that classroom, into a positive through this multiplayer, through your multiplayer classroom experiences?
Yeah, absolutely. And I should say, I'm actually not the right person to answer that. So that actually would be Lee Sheldon. So he's the multiplayer classroom guy, and I was like the VR and immersion side of that thing. So that he's actually been doing this with large classes, both physical and completely online. So he has done variations on the multiplayer classroom idea for purely online courses with hundreds of students in them, using a lot of the same tricks. So, like some kind of a MacGuffin that everybody has to go out and find, and somebody who's a plant in the class. There's, it's like TV, right? So like TV has like these tropes, but yeah, it actually can be used in really interesting ways, and he's done it with a pretty wide range of different classes. So some things that are very technical classes, and some things that are like business ethics classes, and with high school students, a whole range of different things. It takes a kind of different sort of course prep for the instructor to figure out how to turn your class into a game structure. And it also does take this ability to improvise, because it's based off this alternate reality game idea where you construct a fictional reality for your players through real world things like websites and phone numbers that you call and get things. So it's also a kind of a living theater approach. And so you have to be, to make it work really, really well, you have to be on board with doing that, but it can be really good.
I tried to turn my classroom of 150 people into the re-embodiment of a Roman triumph.
Mm-hmm. It all comes down to the story and the game mechanics. Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
I think we have time for maybe just one more. I say that and there isn't one more. Sorry, I cursed all of you.
So shall we thank Ben Chang one more time for his wonderful talk?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you all for coming. It's been a real pleasure to be here.